anytime at cspanshop.org. Washington Journal continues.
Joining us now to talk about U.S. bail systems and reforms is Lisel Petis. She is Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties Policy Director for R Street Institute. Lisel, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So first, tell us about your background in criminal justice and how you came to this topic.
Sure. So I actually am a former prosecutor. After being a prosecutor for several years, went on to run a nonprofit agency for victims of domestic and sexual violence. Also did 5 years on my local city council, and so took those different perspectives into how policy comes together in our criminal justice system and came to R Street.
Well, let's talk about what President Trump did on Monday in the Oval Office. He did sign orders aimed at ending cashless bail. Let's listen to what he said, and then we'll talk about it.
We run things like we run this. We like clean, we like beautiful, and we like safe, and that's what we're getting. So I'll start signing the executive orders. To me, this is a very, very big deal. One of the executive orders has to do with cashless bail. That was when the big crime in this country started. And I can tell you who did it, when, but I don't want to do that because others followed pretty quickly. But that was when it happened. Somebody kills somebody, they go in, don't worry about it, no cash, come back in a couple of months, we'll give you a trial. You never see the person again. And I mean, they kill people and they get out. Cashless bail. They thought it was discriminatory to make people put up money because they just killed 3 people lying on a street. Any street all over the country, cashless bail. We're ending it, but we're starting by ending it in D.C., and that we have the right to do through federalization.
So let's talk about that, Lisel. First of all, what is cashless bail?
Which is a great question because the term gets thrown around a lot, and not many people are familiar with what cash bail is, what the bail system even is, what cashless bail is. But really, it's a system that pivots towards risk-based assessments to determine if somebody should get out. So are they going to be a public safety risk? Are they going to not show up for court? That being the main consideration, rather than just giving a money amount for somebody to pay based upon their offense to get out. So cash bail is that money amount that's assigned to an offense and people can pay to get out. And a cashless bail system generally uses preventative detention, meaning somebody cannot pay at all to get out. They are stuck in jail until their trial, or they're let out with conditions that are non-cash based.
Now, the president said essentially you can kill people and then say, okay, come back later, and they never come back again. Is that what happens?
Well, I do want to just point out first that President Trump has hit on something that people are not immediately understanding is a big problem right now, which is there are many people in our communities that are feeling that more needs to be done around crime and homelessness. That is true. A lot of people are seeing that they want more to be done. The kind of part that goes astray is whether or not the bail system is responsible for people feeling unsafe. You will hear from prosecutors and police officers that they get very frustrated with what they call kind of a revolving door into the system, or a catch and release where people get picked up, get out again, commit another crime. These are real issues to talk about and see about good solutions. But when we're talking about murderers, almost across the board, but I will say there are some states that don't have an ability to hold murderers in, but a lot of those individuals are not getting out at all, even for a cash amount. They are being held because they are a public safety risk. Doesn't mean that in some places they may get out, but in the vast majority of circumstances, murderers are not being released from jail pretrial.
Now, you wrote an analysis at rstreet.org about 2 weeks ago. You said why federal repeal of no cash bail laws would be unconstitutional and bad policy. Explain both of those things.
Sure. So the 10th Amendment is our clearest kind of law talking about state rights, that it's really up to the states to be doing these, what we call kind of traditional policing powers, which would include how the criminal justice system deals with state crimes. And it really would be hard to do anything as a mandate to states or municipalities requiring them to do something specific because of the 10th Amendment. And that is such an important part for federalism, for the sovereignty of states. And it seems clear that the president actually understands that that is a step too far that he cannot take. Because in the executive orders, really what's being done is pulling on those kind of purse strings to determine whether or not they can use grant funds and funding power to get the outcomes that they're hoping for. So the first one is more of the legal question. Can the federal government tell states what to do? And generally the answer is no. Even their power to pull the purse strings is very limited by SCOTUS saying that things have to not be done in a punitive nature. They need to have some sort of correlation with what you're actually trying to impose. On the other side, the question is this even really the right solution? So if we do think that people are feeling unsafe, if we do think that crime is not where it should be, that it needs to really come down and public safety is a priority, should we be messing with the bail system? And the answer might be yes, but I will say that saying universally that cashless bail is the problem, it really is going to put us into a bad spot. And specifically, I'd like to kind of point out places like Texas and Tennessee. Both states just recently have expanded their preventive detention. So again, that is where you cannot pay to get out. You will be stuck in because the courts have found that you are a public safety risk. They have found that cash bail is not the appropriate tool to be using those cases. They don't want people to get the chance to pay their way out at all. They want them to be detained. So when we're talking about removing these cash bail or cashless bail systems who have really started pivoting to preventative detention versus conditions with release, we're actually allowing more people to get out because they can now pay versus saying no, they're going to be withheld regardless.
If you'd like to discuss with our guest, Lisel Petis, the bail system and criminal justice reform, you can go ahead and start calling now. Our lines are regional this time, so if you're in the Eastern or Central time zones, it's 202-748-8000. If you're in Mountain or Pacific, it's 202-748-8001. Now, if you have any experience with the bail system, whether for yourself or a close family member or a friend, give us a call on a line which is 202-748-8002. Of course, you can use our line for texting, which is 202-748-8003, or you can post to social media. So, Lisel, what are the systems in place that determine bail? And is it the same for everyone, or is it somewhat arbitrary depending on what judge you get? Like if you're the severity of what you're accused of, or your previous convictions, or your previous experience with the criminal justice system?
So all those things matter. First, what matters is what state you're in. Every state has very different bail laws. You have states like New York who does not consider a dangerousness factor, which allows somebody to determine whether or not they're going to be a public safety risk to determine their release. But most states do have a dangerousness factor, so each state is going to be different. Within those states, there's going to be a difference between who can be detained with preventative detention and who can be released. And then if they are released, what conditions of release may exist. And that could be cash. The only state that has actually fully eliminated and abolished cash bail is Illinois. But you have other states like New Jersey who has functionally eliminated it because they do not really use it. But even in those two states, the number of crimes that can be preventively detained versus required release are different. But then certainly the judges you go before may change that determination too. Some may really lean into conditions of release, such as ankle monitors, supervision, things of that nature, where others may think if I set a high cash bail amount, maybe that will keep them in, which is a very different consideration. But all those are different. And then we go even a layer further, and now we talk about bail bondsmen and whether or not bail bondsmen exist in a state that help people get out at just 10% of that bail amount versus having to pay a full cash amount. So it is wildly different across the nation. And then certainly there are differences between courts and judges.
And what about the backlog? How quickly can you get a determination of bail set once somebody is arrested?
Again, it matters on the state you're in, but most states do have a standard saying essentially that it needs to be prompt. In some states, that's actually defined within 24 or 48 hours. Others, it could be up to 7 days. It really depends on where you're at. It can also a lot of times matter whether or not you're in an urban area or a rural area, because some rural jurisdictions don't have judges that actually come in every day. So it really depends, but across the nation, it is supposed to be a quick and prompt hearing done pretty immediate after arrest. Like I said, 24 to 48 is kind of the standard normal, but there are definitely places that it's more like a week.
And Lisel, we got this posting on X who says the bail system doesn't solve crime. It's just a way to make money. What do you say to that?
I would question money to who. The bail system certainly benefits from helping people get out. There are some states where the courts actually kind of work in that way. So I'm not sure I would say that it's a money-making system by any means, and that's certainly not what it's supposed to be. I will agree that I wouldn't say it's necessarily a crime-fighting tool. We're talking about people who've already committed a crime, and it's the aftermath. But it can be used, like I said, for that public safety consideration. So there is an element, if you think somebody is a public safety risk and they're may continue to commit crimes, there are tools that can be used within the bail system to help keep that individual either detained or given conditions to hopefully alleviate some of the things that may be causing the criminal behavior. So I agree, but have a little bit more nuanced of a look on that.
And what's the situation in Washington, D.C. and the D.C. does have the cashless bail, and what impact has it had? I mean, have crime rates improved? Has there been any improvement as a result?
This is such a hot button question right now. The most recent data that's come out has shown that there has been a huge decline in DC crime rates. The lowest in about 30 years, kind of across the board, both violent and property crimes. But those numbers really have been called into question. There was a commander who was discharged because it turned out he was changing some of the crime statistics. And so people are really having a hard time believing the numbers. I would say that they seem to be true because they hold up with also some of the other data that's been coming out. But regardless, if people don't feel safe, they don't care what the data says. So it's still that consideration of, I do think people are wanting more to be done, but is the bail system the issue? And if it is it that it needs to be completely changed, or is it that it needs to be tweaked? Certainly things that can be looked at are, if somebody is out on bail and they commit a new offense, are bonds being revoked? I mean, could that be the biggest thing that needs to change, is a stiffer kind of sanction when somebody is not complying while out on bail? It doesn't mean that you need to dismantle the whole system.
All right, let's take calls. We'll start with David, Flemington, New Jersey. Good morning, David.
Good morning. Thank you. Yes, I'm not exactly sure how the bail system impacts this, but my son was mugged in a city in New Jersey by 5 guys, and it got complicated because 3 were minors and 2 were adults. So the punishments were different. There's that issue. How severe should be the punishment versus minor versus adult. But the other issue was one of them got out during that time. This was Essex County, New Jersey. And I know one of them got out pending charges or trial, and he was actually involved in something else. So there does seem to be an ease with which people can be back on the streets after committing crimes, and I'm not sure if that's due to the bail system or not. But I do thank you for taking my call.
Lisel.
It's hard to know, like in those specific situations, if the person was released on bail and something happened, or if they immediately pled guilty and the sentence was, different. So that's always a hard one to just do on a case-by-case basis without knowing all the details around it. Certainly bail is a factor in people being released. I think it's always extremely important to remember there is no crystal ball. We cannot say, for certainty who is going to be high risk, who is not. And so judges do have to rely on things like risk assessments, previous criminal history, the facts of the individual case to make those determinations of whether or not somebody can be safely released. Sometimes they will get it wrong, unfortunately, but really the bail system has a obligation to weigh both public safety risk and making sure that there's accountability and somebody's going to show up for court with the presumption of innocence and individuals' rights to be free without a compelling reason. Our jails are not big enough to hold every single person who commits a crime, so some people are going to have to get out. We wouldn't want every single person held for crimes. The vast majority of crimes in America are actually low-level offenses like driving under restraint, simple theft. If those individuals are going to be held on every single charge, not only are we going to have to build much bigger jails, it's going to be extremely costly to taxpayers, but those individuals are also not going back out in the workforce. They likely could lose their job, lose housing, and we could actually see some pretty catastrophic events if we were holding everybody. So it really is a balancing act. I'm actually a fan of the New Jersey model in that they have one of the broader systems that allow for preventative detention and but also don't use cash for those that can get out. But like I said, sometimes, unfortunately, judges do get it wrong, and it's really unfortunate when that happens.
We've got a question on text from Dan in Pennsylvania who says, does the rate of crimes increase with population density, i.e. cities versus suburbs versus rural areas? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think pretty universally that is true. There are usually higher crime rates within those highly dense urban areas. How that plays into bail, I think, is a different question. But yes, I would agree generally that's true.
I want to put up a portion of President Trump's executive order regarding this topic, and it says this: maintaining order and public safety requires incarcerating individuals whose pending criminal charges or criminal history demonstrate a clear ongoing risk to society. When these individuals are released without bail under city or state policies, they are permitted, even encouraged, to further endanger law-abiding, hardworking Americans because they know our laws will not be enforced. Our great law enforcement officers risk their lives to arrest potentially violent criminals only to be forced to arrest the same individuals, sometimes for the same crimes, while they await trial on the previous charges. This is a waste of public resources and a threat to public safety. Lisel, what do you think of that, and are those assertions corroborated by your research?
So I actually largely agree with the idea that if individuals are committing violent offenses, sexual offenses, they have criminal histories, and there is believed to have concern that they are a risk to public safety, they should be held in detention. I think most people agree with that assertion, and I think in most cases that is happening. Again, not everywhere, not all the time. Every courtroom's different, but this goes along with that trend that we're seeing, that people are trying to actually broaden their right to withhold bail entirety, right? Like, so people cannot pay to get out, that they are actually being held for those violent offenses and people who have criminal histories. I also think that, again, people are frustrated when they see somebody commit a very serious crime, get out, and commit another one. Even low-level offenses, if somebody is just getting out and racking up another charge, another charge, another charge. But this is very different to say we need a cash bail system to handle that versus we need to figure out what is going on in those cases and doing a better job of addressing those. So again, cash bail means you can pay to get out. I mean, I have seen somebody who, as a former prosecutor, got out on $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 bails because they were a drug dealer. They had access to money. There was a bondsman who, they make a lot of money off of helping pay those bonds, and they get out. That's not keeping us safe either, allowing just people to pay to get out. So the question it really is could a cashless bail system where people are required to stay in if they're a risk, but given conditions, if they can be safely let out, could be a better system, just tweaked. Maybe it's more offenses need to be available for preventative detention. Maybe it's that revocation of bond needs to be used more often if people are committing, similar charges over and over again. But throwing out an entire system based on things that we all agree about and aren't necessarily happening just seems kind of out of touch when there could be these smaller changes that would really help.
All right, Adriana is in California and she has experience with the bail system. Adriana, tell us about your background.
Well, I'm a former prosecutor, but I'm calling also because all of us have been subjected to traffic infractions. When you get pulled over by the police and you sign the ticket that you're going to show up in court, it's essentially a bail system. And before you go to court, you'll get a notice in the mail that you can post bail and forfeit the bail to pay the traffic violation. So what about that? I mean, we pay insurance. Many of us are professionals and we buy bonds. Contractors have contractor bonds. It's a form of insurance. And I think it crosses over all aspects of our life and that we should support that idea. Maybe there should be some reforms, but in my experience, when people have to pay a bond, it means they take the matter seriously. And sometimes the grandmothers are posting the bonds, and the criminals will be very cognizant of that fact and show up to court because they don't want grandma to lose their money.
All right, Adriana.
Okay.
Go right ahead, Lisel.
So again, every state's different, but the vast majority actually use bondsmen. And when a bondsman's used, if there's a $100,000 bond set, the individual gives 10% of that, so $10,000 to the bondsman. They are unable to get that money back. It is non-refundable. It is paid, and that is how the bondsman makes their money. And then they're expected to show up for court. So I have a hard time believing that individuals that give money to a bondsman who have no ability to get that money back really feel any financial incentive at all to actually show up for court. There's actually been quite a bit of research done, too, that even when the person doesn't show up for court, neither the bondsman or the defendant end up having to pay the full amount of the bond either. So the financial incentive, I think, is really kind of a fallacy out there. There are a couple states that require cash bonds, which means it is the individual themselves that has to pay it to the court, or that the court will do kind of what we call a partially secured bond. So the 10% goes to the court, and the court can then refund that money if the person shows up. But that is actually the minority kind of way to do bond. That is not the majority. That is certainly something that could be explored as more of an incentive. But I would say the bondsman industry that is used in most of the states, and I mean literally most of them, is not actually creating a financial incentive because that person has no ability to get that money back.
Let's go to Ralph in Las Vegas. Good morning, Ralph.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, what's the percentage of first-time offenders versus repeat offenders? Is it that much different? I guess that's my question.
I unfortunately don't have a specific stat on that. You do see that there's a very small percentage of people that commit a greater percentage of the crime. But a lot of times that's not necessarily even getting out on bail. That's actually after going through the entire system, which is another discussion for another day of how the system could be doing a better job to rehabilitate. But there are plenty of people who come in as first-time offenders. And like I said, the vast majority of cases in the system are actually misdemeanors or low-level offenses, often committed by people in our community that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So that, I mean, they certainly are out there. I couldn't give you a statistic, though.
Lisel, I just wanted to ask you about juvenile crime and what you're seeing as evidence of what could make that better, whether it is stricter enforcement, whether it is harsher penalties, trying them as adults, those kinds of things.
So that is a huge question, and I'm happy to try and answer. The juvenile system is a very different system. So even when you talk about bail, it is a different determination of removing somebody from their home and their parents, and where should they be going into detention? Should they just be going into another facility? It is largely not as cash-based of a system. It's also a very different system in that most juvenile courts, and again, every state is different, but they really focus on rehabilitation to try and get kids back on the right track so they are not back in the system later on. And the reality is that's the research shows that kids just are more resilient, they're more malleable, they're much more able to be influenced by what's going on in their life. So the idea is that if you can actually, out of all the different populations, try and influence somebody to change for the better, the juvenile population is the most likely to have that change. And so there are tons of programs that go into juveniles. Preventatively is probably the best you can do, which is trying to keep kids out of bad situations, or to help them if they are in bad situations. And that can be everything from a house full of violence, which unfortunately you do see a lot of correlation between kids who grow up in households with violence and becoming violent later on in life. It could be their exposure to gun violence. There's a lot of retaliatory crimes with juveniles and kind of these groups that they run around with and see through social media. So really that preventative part is really important to try and get them back on track to repair the harms that they've experienced so that they're not then perpetrating on later in life themselves. I think certainly one of the concerns is there are suggestions to bring more juveniles into the adult system. What we need to remember is the vast majority of these individuals will be coming back out and will be coming back into our communities. And do we really think that a 14 or 50-year-old going into an adult system to learn more about crime from older individuals is really going to make them safer when they come out later on, versus really going after those rehabilitation options, things that could help them actually change their course in life, get back on track, and do something better. Certainly, if I was walking down an alleyway and I was confronted by somebody who'd either done the last 10 years with a bunch of adults in prison or done the last 10 years trying to rehabilitate and make a better life for themselves, I'd rather be coming across the person who's been rehabilitated versus the person who's been in prison with much older individuals who've committed much more crime.
All right, the website is rstreet.org. That's Lisel Petis. She's the Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties Policy Director there. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And we'll complete the program with open forum, so you can start calling in now, whatever's on your mind. The numbers 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, and 202-748-8002 for Independents. We'll be right back.
Honor the person who first showed you democracy in action and ignite America 250, C-SPAN's 18-month ad-free celebration of our nation's story. Give $25 or more by August 31st at cspan.org/donate and add your democracy hero to our online wall to keep these vital stories alive for viewers and learners everywhere. As our thanks, you'll receive an exclusive Democracy Unfiltered decal. Your gift helps make C-SPAN possible. Visit cspan.org/donate today and join us in keeping America's story alive. Thank you.
This fall, C-SPAN invites you on a powerful journey through the stories that define a nation. From the halls of our nation's most iconic libraries comes America's Book Club, a bold, original series where ideas, history, and democracy meet. Hosted by renowned author and civic leader David Rubenstein, each week features in-depth conversations with the thinkers shaping our national story. Among this season's remarkable guests, John Grisham, master storyteller of the American justice system. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, exploring the Constitution, the court, and the role of law in American life. Famed chef and global relief entrepreneur Jose Andres, reimagining food. Henry Louis Gates, chronicler of race, identity, and the American experience. The books, the voices, the places that preserve our past and spark the ideas that will shape our future. America's Book Club, premiering this fall, only on C-SPAN.
Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back to Washington Journal.